It started as just another star-studded night on The Tonight Show, until Chris Evans noticed something that made him forget every word he was about to say and changed everything forever. Studio 6B was electric, with that particular energy that came with Marvel appearances. Tonight, Chris Evans was back on The Tonight Show to discuss his latest projects and reflect on his journey beyond the Captain America shield. The iconic New York City skyline glittered through the studio's massive windows, creating the perfect backdrop for what everyone expected would be another engaging conversation. The audience was buzzing with excitement, filled with Marvel fans and parents who had brought their children to see their real-life hero. What nobody noticed during the pre-show excitement was the boy in row 5, seat 11. Miguel Rodriguez, 12 years old, sat perfectly still in his navy blue button-down shirt, his small hand unconsciously touching a vintage Captain America pin attached to his collar. The pin was slightly tarnished, clearly decades old, and obviously treasured beyond its monetary value. Miguel had won his tickets through a school essay contest about heroes. The Captain America pin had belonged to his grandfather, Eduardo Rodriguez, who had collected comic books since the 1940s and had been Miguel's best friend, father figure, and moral compass after his parents died in a car accident when Miguel was 5. Mijo, Eduardo would say during their Sunday afternoon comic book sessions, Captain America isn't special because he's strong, he's special because he never stops trying to do what's right, even when it's hard. Those sessions had ended abruptly when Eduardo suffered a heart attack while gardening just 2 months ago, leaving Miguel with a collection of comics, a vintage pin, and a hole in his heart that felt too big to ever fill. The show opened with Jimmy's usual warmth and energy. When he introduced Chris Evans, the applause was sustained and genuine. Chris walked onto the stage in his characteristic navy blazer, hugged Jimmy warmly, and settled into the guest chair with the relaxed presence of someone comfortable with both fame and responsibility. "Chris Evans, everybody," Jimmy said, settling behind his wooden desk. "Even though you've moved beyond the Marvel Universe, people still see you as Captain America. How does it feel to know that you represent something so meaningful to so many people?" Chris smiled that genuine smile that had endeared him to millions. "You know, Jimmy, it's both humbling and terrifying. When you put on that suit, you realize you're not just playing a character anymore. You're representing an ideal that people, especially kids, look up to. The responsibility of that never really goes away." As Chris spoke, his eyes naturally scanned the audience. That's when he saw him. Miguel, in row 5, sitting with an attention that went beyond typical fan excitement, his small fingers unconsciously fidgeting with something on his collar. "Actually, Jimmy," Chris said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "I'm seeing something in the audience right now that's reminding me why I loved playing that character so much." Jimmy looked curious, sensing that Chris was about to take the conversation somewhere unplanned. Chris stood up and walked toward the edge of the stage, his eyes finding Miguel again, the young man in row 5 in the navy shirt. "I couldn't help but notice you're wearing something special. Is that a Captain America pin?" Miguel looked around frantically, pointing to himself with a shocked expression. The audience turned to look at him, and he felt his face flush with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Yes, you," Chris said gently, his voice carrying that characteristic warmth that made strangers feel like friends. "That's a beautiful pin. It looks vintage. What's the story there?" Miguel slowly stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He looked down at the pin on his collar, then back up at Chris. "It belonged to my grandfather," he said, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly through the studio. The studio fell slightly quieter. Something in Miguel's tone, the way he said "belonged," suggested a story that went deeper than simple family sharing. "Your grandfather was a Captain America fan," Chris asked softly. Miguel nodded, tears already starting to form in his eyes. He collected comics since he was a kid. We used to read them together every Sunday. He taught me that being a hero isn't about being strong. It's about doing what's right, even when it's scary. Chris felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about entertainment. This was about how stories become lifelines, how fictional heroes can teach real-world courage. When did you lose him, Miguel? Chris asked, the question gentle but direct. 2 months ago, Miguel said, his voice getting stronger but heavy with emotion. Heart attack. I was supposed to show him my essay about heroes for school, but I never got the chance. Jimmy immediately understood what was happening. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was about to become something much more profound. He walked down from the stage and joined Chris at the edge, abandoning every protocol of television production. Miguel, Jimmy said gently, what would your grandfather say if he could see you here tonight, wearing his pin and meeting his hero? Miguel looked at the empty space beside him, where his grandfather should have been, then at Chris, then at Jimmy. He'd probably tell me to stand up straight and remember that Captain America always treats people with respect, he said, with a small smile through his tears. And he'd ask Chris if he ever gets tired of being everyone's hero. Chris laughed, but his eyes were full of emotion. Your grandfather sounds like he was incredibly wise. What was his name? Eduardo Rodriguez, Miguel replied immediately. But everyone called him Abuelo Eddie. He was a mechanic, but he always said his real job was teaching me how to be a good man. Chris nodded, understanding something profound about the way certain people could shape entire lives through simple daily lessons. Miguel, can I ask you something? Do you still have your grandfather's comic collection? It's in my room, Miguel said. I read them sometimes, but it's not the same without him explaining all the stories behind the stories. What was his favorite Captain America comic? Chris asked. Miguel's eyes lit up with the memory. Captain America ends 109. He said it was the one where Cap learns that being a symbol means more than just fighting bad guys. It means giving people hope when they can't find it themselves. Chris felt tears forming in his own eyes. That particular comic dealt with themes of loss, responsibility, and finding strength in the memory of those who came before. Miguel, Chris said, I want to come up there and talk with you about your grandfather. Would that be okay? Miguel looked stunned. You'd really do that? I'd be honored, Chris said, because I think Eduardo understood something about heroism that I'm still learning. Chris Evans, one of the most beloved actors in the world, left the stage and walked into the audience. The cameras followed him, but everyone in the studio somehow understood that this wasn't about creating good television. This was about something more sacred. Chris reached Miguel's row, and the people around them shifted to make space. He sat down in the empty seat next to Miguel, and for a moment, a man who had portrayed America's greatest hero and a boy who understood what that meant sat together in the middle of a talk show audience. Tell me more about your grandfather, Chris said simply. Miguel's composure broke completely. He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 5. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to tie my shoes, how to stand up to bullies without becoming one. He said Captain America comics weren't just stories, they were instruction manuals for how to live. Chris reached over and gently touched the pin on Miguel's collar. This is beautiful. How long did he have it? Since 1952, Miguel whispered. He bought it with his first paycheck when he was 16. He wore it to his high school graduation, his wedding, the day I was born. He said it reminded him that every day was a chance to be someone's hero. The studio was completely quiet now, everyone hanging on every word. Jimmy, still standing nearby, felt tears forming in his own eyes. Miguel, Chris said, what would you want to tell your grandfather if he could hear you right now? Miguel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I'd tell him that I'm trying to be brave like he taught me, but it's really hard without him. And I'd tell him that I finally met Captain America and that he's exactly the kind of person Abuelo always said heroes should be. Chris felt something break open in his chest. Miguel, can I share something with you? The reason I loved playing Captain America wasn't because of the shield or the super serum. It was because the character represented something your grandfather already understood, that real strength comes from taking care of other people. Chris stood up and addressed the entire studio. Everyone, I want to tell you about Eduardo Rodriguez. He was a mechanic from Queens who collected comic books and raised his grandson to understand that heroism isn't about special powers. It's about making the choice to help others, even when it's difficult. The audience was completely quiet, hanging on every word. Eduardo used Captain America comics to teach Miguel about courage, kindness, and standing up for what's right, Chris continued. He turned entertainment into education, fantasy into life lessons. That's not just being a good grandfather, that's being a real hero. Chris turned back to Miguel. Miguel, your grandfather didn't just collect Captain America comics, he lived them. And now it's your turn. Chris reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made the entire audience gasp. A small, official Captain America shield pin, not vintage like Miguel's, but clearly special, clearly meaningful. Miguel, Chris said, this pin was given to me by Marvel Studios when I finished filming my last Captain America movie. It was meant to represent the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever comes next. Chris knelt down in front of Miguel, holding the pin. I want you to have this, not because you lost your grandfather, but because you're carrying on his mission. You're wearing his pin with pride. You're remembering his lessons, and you're showing everyone here tonight what it really means to honor someone's memory. Chris carefully pinned the new shield next to Eduardo's vintage pin on Miguel's collar. Now you have something from your grandfather and something from me. And whenever you miss him, you remember that the greatest heroes are the ones who teach other people how to be heroes too. Miguel touched both pins, feeling the weight of legacy and love connecting past and present. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Abuelo would have loved this moment so much. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't entertainment applause. It was recognition applause, acknowledgement of something sacred that had happened in front of everyone. Chris had one more surprise. Miguel, your grandfather taught you that heroes do what's right, even when it's scary. What would he say is the most important thing about being brave? Miguel stood up, touching both pins on his collar, drawing strength from his grandfather's memory and Chris's gesture. He always said that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even though you're scared. And he said the most important thing is to remember that you're never too small to make a big difference. The studio fell completely silent as Miguel's words sank in. Then Chris stood up and began to applaud, followed by Jimmy, followed by every person in the audience. They were applauding not just Miguel's courage, but Eduardo's wisdom and the understanding that the most important lessons often come from the most ordinary heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion, tonight we learned something important from Miguel Rodriguez and his grandfather Eduardo. We learned that real heroes don't wear capes. They teach children that strength comes from kindness. Chris added his own message, still standing with Miguel. And we learned that the best way to honor someone's memory isn't to be sad that they're gone. It's to live the lessons they taught us and pass them on to others. The show ended differently that night. Jimmy made an announcement. Tonight, we learned that heroism isn't about special powers or famous shields. It's about people like Eduardo Rodriguez, who spent his life teaching his grandson that everyone has the power to make someone else's day better. Miguel Rodriguez returned home to Queens the next day, but he left New York with something he hadn't had since his grandfather's death: unshakable certainty that Eduardo's lessons were still with him, still guiding him, still making him stronger. The two pins on his collar became inseparable symbols. Miguel wore them to school, to family gatherings, to every important moment in his young life, and whenever someone asked about them, he would tell them about his grandfather, who collected comics, and Chris Evans, who understood that real heroes are the people who teach other people how to be brave. 6 months later, Miguel started a comic book club at his school called Abuelo's Heroes. Chris attended the first meeting via video call, and he told the group something that became their motto: the greatest superpower is making someone else feel like they have superpowers too. Chris kept his promise in ways beyond just that night's gesture. He established a scholarship fund for children who had lost parental figures. The Tonight Show episode became one of the most watched segments in the show's history, inspiring comic book stores across the country to report increased sales and children's hospitals to begin using superhero stories as therapy tools for young patients processing loss. The vintage Captain America pin became legendary in Miguel's family, carrying Eduardo's lessons about courage and kindness. Miguel still reads Captain America comics every Sunday, ending each session as his grandfather did. Remember, mijo, the real shield isn't made of vibranium, it's made of love. Miguel learned that grief doesn't have to mean the end of connection. It can mean the beginning of a new way to honor the people who shaped us. Eduardo may never have his name in a comic book, but his legacy lives on in every choice Miguel makes, every person Miguel helps, and every moment Miguel chooses courage over fear. Because that's what heroes do. They don't just protect the world from dangers, they protect the memories, the lessons, and the love that make the world worth protecting in the first place. They teach us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remember someone who taught you how to be brave. It wasn't just late-night television that night, it was a masterclass in how legacy works, how love transcends loss, and how sometimes the most important heroes are the ones who never get their names in comic books, but deserve to have their stories told anyway. Some pins carry more than decoration. They carry entire lifetimes of wisdom, love, and the understanding that being a hero isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being kind, and teaching someone else that they have the power to be heroic too.